Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar on the unprecedented Texas floods. Hi everybody, I'm Bob Ottenhoff and I'm the President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. During the past year, Texas has experienced 6 federally declared disasters involving floods and other natural disasters. The most recent occurred only last month when at least 18 people were killed. More than 35 trillion gallons of rain has fallen in Texas during the past month. During the next hour, we'd like to take a closer look at how Texas has been affected by floods in the past year and the ways funders can help to meet key needs. We're joined in this discussion today by a panel of individuals with great experience in the disaster response arena and rich expertise in Texas and flood response. Joining us will be Stephanie Blair, who's a philanthropic service manager at Greater Houston Community Foundation, where she's responsible for the research, design, and management of philanthropic programming for corporate donors and clients, including employee disaster relief funds. Stephanie also manages the Greater Houston Storm Relief Fund, established by Mayor Sylvester Turner. Jim Davis is a voluntary agency liaison with FEMA's Region 4 office in Atlanta, Georgia, and is currently deployed to Austin, Texas to support the state and local providers in their work to assist the many communities impacted by multiple disasters over the past year. Jim first came to disaster work in 2005 following Hurricane Katrina as a crisis counselor providing support to first responders in the greater New Orleans area. Damian Morales is the program specialist for disaster services at the OneStar Foundation, which is the State Service Commission for Texas. In this role, he's responsible for developing, implementing, and evaluating OneStar's activities related to disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Damian is also chair of the Central Texas VOAD and Advocacy and Communications Committee chair for the Texas VOAD. Elizabeth Disco-Shearer is the Chief Operating Officer of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's Disaster Services Division in Washington, D.C. She coordinates disaster recovery across the United States and is managing recovery projects in 31 states. Currently, she serves on the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's National Disaster Committee, the National VOAD Drought Task Force, and is the former chair of the National VOAD Disaster Case Management Committee. We want to get your participation too in this webinar, and so over the next hour, we'll be occasionally asking for your comments and questions. You can do that by submitting a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions at the end of the webinar. And by the way, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for your use. And now I'd like to turn to Stacey Frasier from the Council on Foundations to welcome everyone today. Stacey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. My name is Stacey Frasier. I'm the manager of the Knowledge Center here at the Council on Foundations. On behalf of the Council and my colleagues here, we'd like to express our sincere sympathy and thoughts to the communities affected by the flooding situation. On a personal level, I'm a 5th-generation Texas native, and I have family personally impacted by this situation, so this is near and dear to me. We know individuals in times like this want to give through charity, and it's sometimes difficult to navigate how to do so while remaining in legal compliance. And so the Council's legal services team is available to help our members properly take account for, distribute funds where they're needed the most in this difficult time. I appreciate you being here, joining us on this call today, and in partnership with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we truly hope you reach out and utilize the services we can provide you with.
Okay, thank you so much, Stacey, and thank you to the Council on Foundations. We enjoy our partnership and are glad we're working together on this. So let's start our discussion by asking Jim Davis to give us sort of the big picture. Jim, you've got a big region you're responsible for. You're now based in Austin. Can you kind of lay the territory for us. Give us a picture of the scene that currently exists in Texas.
Yeah, sure, and thank you for including FEMA on the webinar. I want to say I'll apologize if there's background noise. I'm actually in the field office, and so you may hear some noise. From the highest level, the 6 presidentially declared disasters occurred here over the past year are unprecedented. FEMA's had a presence here since the first declaration last year in the spring, and there are continuing flooding. In fact, there are some counties that are still in early response phase or extended response phase from the latest river flooding. So we've had flooding all the way from the Oklahoma border down to the Gulf and over to Louisiana. There are currently, for the 6 disasters, 5 of which received individual assistance declarations, in excess of 65,000 households have applied for FEMA assistance. It's important to keep in mind that this doesn't account for everyone impacted, but that's a significant number of folks. We also have 13 more counties that are being assessed for a declaration from this latest flooding. Many counties have been flooded multiple times. And so this is, as I said, pretty unprecedented. And I would say from a voluntary agency liaison perspective, the local folks are pretty exhausted, and a lot of the resources are really growing thin. So that's my take. Pending questions.
I think you've got a slide on that shows us the scope of the damage.
Yes, the number of counties. Yes, if there's, we'll go to that first slide. Yeah, this is a slide, and this information is available publicly. It's public source, and it shows you the number of counties in yellow that were declared for disasters over the past year. And you can see that's really a vast area. And even those counties that are in white and unhighlighted, many of those were impacted but didn't reach the threshold for a FEMA declaration.
So when it's when there's a declaration like this, give us some sense of the level of damage that is most likely has occurred. What does that mean to the layman, and what are the implications of that?
Yes, in order to request a federal declaration, local emergency management does local assessments, and that's door to door, house to house, infrastructure. All of those kind of things are taken into account, and then that information is fed up to the state when the local folks determine that it exceeds their capacity. And the same principle applies for the state, having their capacity exceeded and request federal assistance. And that federal assistance includes, or may include, individual assistance, which is the program that I work with. And that brings resources for housing, home repair, temporary housing, some other needs in terms of personal property, that sort of thing. And also a large cadre of personnel to support the state's efforts in addressing unmet needs. And as you know, as you go forward, those unmet, the initial kind of high-profile public response and that sort of thing is important, but it really, in this kind of situation with multiple disaster, means that local folks are going to be dealing with this for months or years to come.
And I think that's one of the things we want to underscore today. Those key words you just mentioned, local folks will be dealing with this for months and years to come. Why so, Jim? Why will it be months and years to come?
Well, the impact is so broad, and not just broad, but deep. The scope here, the number of counties, for one thing, but also many of the most vulnerable populations are the ones that are least able to recover, even with maximum local, state, and federal benefits. And one of the things that my job is, as a voluntary agency liaison, is to support those local organizations in pulling together, which is a natural thing that they want to do, but often haven't had to do in the past. And so FEMA's support here is temporary. I'm here a few weeks or a few months that kind of support really has to come at the local level, and they are already stretched thin in terms of their resources.
I think you brought us a slide today on that kind of outlines FEMA levels of activity. Maybe we could show that now a minute, just so we get a sense of, let's go on to the next slide, this one here.
Yeah, this is what we call the sequence of delivery. And if you look at the orange box at the beginning and the end, that shows that, the voluntary organizations and local folks they're the first in and they're the last out. It's their communities. And, resources like insurance, FEMA programs, Small Business Administration actually offers loans to disaster survivors when they qualify. Those things are temporary and often inadequate to really address the needs. And that's where you identify those unmet needs that it's so important for the whole community to pull together to address. One example recently that there was a family that lost their home completely. They were able, with some FEMA support, to purchase a home that needed repairs. And the local long-term recovery group partnered actually with faith-based and community organizations, and also a big box home supply that gave them their materials to do the repairs at cost. So that's an example of the kind of thing that has to be ongoing for, as I said, months and years for folks to recover.
Okay, thank you. We've been listening to Jim Davis from FEMA. Let's bring Stephanie Blair into this conversation. Stephanie is the Philanthropic Services Manager at the Greater Houston Community Foundation. Stephanie, tell us a little bit about what your organization has been doing over to address these exceptional floods.
Yeah, so what we are doing is the mayor's office, Mayor Sylvester Turner, contacted us to administer the Greater Houston Storm Relief Fund. And so we are the entity that accepts all of the gifts and does the administrative side of it. And the mayor appointed a committee, an advisory committee, to kind of do some research and due diligence in the areas most affected to see what is needed out there. And one of the things that's really kind of been brought to light through this flooding event from April 18th was areas that were typically or historically not flooded received a lot of water in a very short amount of time. And so it really highlighted some lack of infrastructure in the areas that have vulnerable populations. Last year we had the Memorial Day flooding, but it hit more insured populations and neighborhoods, and so there was definitely assistance and outpouring of help, but this time it was definitely targeted more vulnerable populations. And so we are here to help the mayor's office administer that fund and look at the grant applications and do our due diligence and make sure that we are sending money back out into the community that is most needed, in the areas that it's most needed, and to the organizations that have a history of effectively using that money to serve those populations.
So are you collecting money from a variety of sources? So is this almost becoming like a community fund, it sounds like, with so that other corporations and foundations and individuals can participate in?
Absolutely. We have had hundreds of individual donors give to the fund. Currently, we are almost at 1.8 million, which is a good size for this storm. And of course, there are other funds in Texas, but we've also gotten organizations or companies, corporations that are national but have local branches. So JP Morgan, Verizon, AT&T, Walmart Foundation, and then we've had Houston Endowment. We've had some other local foundations give. And so it's really been exactly what you said, a community fund where everyone is pouring in. We even, just anecdotally, got the sweetest letter from an elementary school in Dallas that they do one fundraising event a year for the kids to kind of go through the process. And they sent $4,000 to the fund, and the mayor sent them a nice personalized thank you note back. But it's really all throughout the state, and then national foundations and corporations are giving in.
I'm curious because we're starting to see more participation and partnership between community foundations and government agencies. And so I'm curious to know, is this an arrangement that you established in advance, or is this one that only happened after the flooding occurred in the Houston area?
It goes back to Ike. You know, for Katrina, we had the Bush-Clinton Fund that was housed here, and then the money was transferred to the Clinton Foundation and distributed to the affected areas. And then Bill White came to us after Ike and set up a fund. And then last year with the Memorial Day funds, they reactivated it, or Memorial Day floods. And then this year, Sylvester Turner immediately, which is one of the lessons learned in the bigger picture, is disaster relief. The sooner you can get out there and appeal to your donors and the community. We've been very successful this round of flooding in getting money in that we can then deploy back out into the community. So we've actually had the fund since Ike, which was 2008, and then they just kind of reactivate it for each disaster.
So that's definitely a lesson learned that all of us can be thinking about. Better partnerships, better coordination between government agencies and the philanthropic community. Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about other funders in Texas with 6 disasters now? I'm curious to know, have the funders in Texas formed a joint fund, or are you doing things together or sharing information? What's the level of activity going on within the state?
Within the state, as far as we're concerned from the Greater Houston Community Foundation, not being a fundraising entity, we have no discretionary funds or funds that we allocate out. So we have not been as involved in the conversation throughout Texas as what other foundations are doing who have unrestricted funding that they can grant and direct back out into the community. But I know that we've had across Texas a big push from the faith-based communities and foundations that we've been in conversations with them of how can we partner and help them by getting money back out to them to get to the community.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. That's Stephanie Blair from the Greater Houston Community Foundation. Let's bring now someone else into this conversation who is in the midst, I guess is a way to say, of all this activity. And that's Damian Morales. He's the program specialist for disaster services at the OneStar Foundation, which is the state service commission for Texas. And he also has a big role to play in the Central Texas VOAD and the Texas VOAD. So Damian, tell us, what has this year been like and how's it going?
Well, thank you, Bob, firstly, for having us on this call. So for those who don't know, VOAD stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. It's a membership organization comprised of faith-based, community-based, and other non-governmental organizations that respond to disasters as a part of their overall mission. So because we've had so many federally declared disasters over the past year, the 6 that were mentioned earlier, as well as about 6 additional disasters that were not declared at the federal level, many of our VOAD partners and organizations throughout the state are reporting great levels of fatigue, both in terms of their volunteer base as well as donor fatigue. A lot of the operations that voluntary organizations will do during the response and recovery phases of disaster are very much dependent upon donations, both from foundations and other philanthropic organizations, as well as through their other constituents. And because of flooding doesn't kind of garner the same level of, I guess one could say, empathy from the communities, because it's harder to see the disaster and the wake of the disaster after a flood than it is, say, a hurricane or a tornado. A lot of organizations, particularly here in Central Texas, where I have a stronger presence, as well as anecdotally throughout the state, are reporting a real struggle to raise funds. This being our 6th disaster and our 3rd straight federal declaration in 3 months, and actually our 3rd straight flood. Folks are just fatigued throughout the state.
Damian, that sounds like a tough situation. Tell us some more about the types of activities your organizations are engaged in right now. Where are the greatest demands coming, and what do you see as the greatest needs at the moment?
Sure, Bob, and that's twofold. So because we've had 6 declared disasters in the past year, we're doing both long-term recovery and response at the same time, in some instances in the same communities. So we have numerous counties that have been declared once, twice, and some counties that have been declared 3 times for 3 separate disasters. A lot of the folks that have been impacted numerous times. So just here, anecdotally, here in Central Texas, we had flooding in Austin, which is the state capital for Texas, in October 2015. And we had folks living in trailers outside of their homes where their homes were rebuilt. Well, this most recent bout of flooding actually destroyed those trailers, so folks are truly homeless. In terms of response activities throughout the state, in some cases, they're still doing feeding and mass care operations. We still have hundreds of folks in shelters. In addition to that, we have long-term recovery going on throughout the state. We have over 20 long-term recovery groups throughout the state. And whereas Houston, Austin, Dallas, some of these major metropolitan areas have strong community foundations that are able to work with the communities to raise the funds, I would say that predominantly throughout the state and a lot of communities, they don't have access to those resources. For example, in Southeast Texas, along the border with Louisiana, there was severe flooding in March, and that's a more impoverished community. They don't have a strong fundraising entity to assist them with recovery and response activities. So there are still folks living in mold-infested homes months after the disaster. And because the VOAD organizations are so fatigued, just in terms of donor fatigue as well as volunteer fatigue, we don't necessarily know that we have the capacity at the moment to help those individuals.
Damian, we often see large numbers of volunteers, both from national organizations and individuals coming into situations. Have you been helped by volunteers, and do you have enough volunteers right now?
So, for example, during the Memorial Day flooding last year, in Central Texas specifically, we had more than 10,000 volunteers. Compare that to the March 2016 flooding along the border with Louisiana that I spoke of earlier. We had 1,200 volunteers, and that included 750 volunteers from one single organization. So we are not getting the volunteer response that we need to help communities recover. A lot of our VOAD partners will come with their own volunteer pool. They rely on spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteers, citizens that see media coverage, citizens that feel a call to help from both within and outside of Texas. And we don't see that. A lot of that is due to just fatigue. A lot of folks have responded to 2, 3 floods, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes within the same communities. And we're just not seeing that volunteer call to action that we truly need to help communities recover throughout the state.
Damian, you asked us to show a slide, which is up here now. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at?
Sure. So as Jim mentioned earlier, we've had 6 federal declarations within the past year. Of those, 5 have been declared for individual assistance, or IA. As you can see on the map on your screens, we have 8 communities that have been impacted 3 separate times by 3 separate unique disasters. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the folks in those communities, it's the same folks, the most vulnerable members of society. So folks over the age of 65, folks with access and functional disabilities, individuals living under the poverty line, single parents with children under the age of 10, and or undocumented individuals. The folks that are most vulnerable members of our society pre-disaster are also those with the greatest amount of need post-disaster. And that's where long-term recovery groups that I spoke about earlier and that Jim mentioned briefly can really help to fill that gap. And that's really dependent upon donations, both from within the state of Texas as well as nationally. Without funds, those long-term recovery groups can't hire the case managers, can't purchase the materials that are needed to rebuild our communities.
One last question for you, Damian. What is the role that the state is playing in all of this, and is there a strong emergency management system, and are they supplying both financial support and logistic support to the VOAD community?
Sure. So traditionally speaking, state divisions of emergency management place much more of a priority on the response phase of disaster than they do recovery. The response phase being the time when you're saving lives, and recovery being that the months and years, and in some cases decades after the disaster that you're helping communities recover. Because we've had so many declarations, we went from one state voluntary agents liaison, which is the liaison between state government and the voluntary community, to we now have 5, 4 of whom are temporary. And that's honestly not enough. We need more of those folks to liaise between the local offices of emergency management, the local elected officials, the State Division of Emergency Management, and the VOAD community. Because with 151 declared counties for individual assistance and public assistance, and only 5 state employees to kind of liaise between the counties and the VOAD community, it's hard. And just in addition, to add to that, because we have VOAD members throughout the state responding to so many different areas of the state, it's oftentimes not easy for us to know who's doing what and where and when they're doing it. However, we do our best to identify where the greatest needs are in terms of the response activities and recovery activities. And we have a phenomenal partnership with Texas government and VOAD. So I'm really proud of that here in Texas.
All right, thank you, Damian. Let's bring now into this conversation Elizabeth Disco-Shearer. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's, and she's managing 31 disaster projects across the country. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts about this situation in Texas? It seems pretty extraordinary.
Yes, it is, and I'm actually a resident of Dallas. I do commute to D.C., so I live between two worlds. And I'm a former Texas VOAD president, and it has been an unprecedented number of disasters in the last year and a half for the state. The society provides rapid response grants out to our councils. We call our chapters councils, and we've been in the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, and Austin, and Dallas, and Tyler, and Beaumont. And as Damian mentioned, in the areas that are more rural, it's very difficult for us to raise dollars, and our volunteers that are there through the long haul are very tired. St. Vincent de Paul works in all the communities that have been mentioned throughout the state, and we do disaster case management. And our volunteers have been working for a year and a half, sometimes with the same families. So it has been a very challenging time for us in the state of Texas.
Talk some more about the work your organization is doing right now, and I'm curious to know, how long are you prepared to provide that service?
Well, currently we're from the Memorial Day flooding that we had last year. We are providing House in a Box. We've had a program in Central Texas. We had a program in East Texas, and we had a program in the Houston area. And the House in a Box program is a national St. Vincent de Paul program that we started after Hurricane Katrina in the state of Texas, and we've taken it all over the country. And we provide for a starter kit for families. We give them a couch, dinette, beds, dressers, linens, bathroom setup. And we're providing that now for last year's flooding. For this year, we are waiting, and as Damian mentioned, we're still doing, and I think Jim did too, we're still doing muck outs in some areas, And so it's very difficult for families for us to do the House in the Box starter kit because the homes aren't ready yet. St. Vincent de Paul also provides immediate assistance through gift cards, and we work with our VOAD partners at the Multi-Agency Resource Center, where a number of agencies come together to provide immediate resources to keep families safe, sound, and secure. And then, as I've mentioned, St. Vincent de Paul does the disaster case management. We're kind of a life coach, and we do a partnership plan to help the families with the long road to recovery.
So, Elizabeth, you're doing these, you're managing projects all over the country. How would you compare the Texas situation to some of the other ones you're doing? Is this really unique, or is this something that happens all across the country?
I think I would say that there's 3 states that are having what I would call epic flooding based on my experiences over the last few years. Texas is one of the ones that's having a great amount of flooding. South Carolina, of course, had a 1,000-year flood. And then Louisiana is also having similar flooding to Texas. And we're serving some of the contiguous counties and parishes both between Texas and Louisiana. So I would say those 3 states have had unprecedented flooding that I have never seen in my lifetime in my years of experience in disaster recovery. In other states such as Illinois, we have a number of communities. In Nebraska, in Wyoming, we have a number of smaller communities that what we call low attention disasters, that they don't get much media attention, but St. Vincent de Paul is there trying to help those families with disaster case management and trying to work with the local community on whatever resources we can find. But when you're dealing with areas like Texas, and especially, let's take, for example, the greater Houston area, it's one of the most culturally diverse metropolitan areas in the United States. And when we're delivering disaster case management services or when we're providing House in the Box, we have to think outside of the box. And we have to deliver that information. We have to put flyers together in a number of languages. We have a lot of families that don't have access to the internet. They wouldn't use the traditional television system because it's not in their language. And so we have to be able to go out both through our faith-based partners and through our parishes in order to communicate with those families. So that makes it an additional challenge. And then, as Damian mentioned, when we get into the Southeast Texas corridor and we're in the rural areas, some of those areas are very difficult to reach. And you have families living in flood-infested homes with mold, and it's a very sad situation.
I want to remind all of our listeners that we're eager to hear your questions, and you can submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to your question as soon as possible. Elizabeth, one last question for you, and maybe Stephanie, you might want to participate then in this as well. Elizabeth, you mentioned the media a little bit, and we know there's a direct correlation between media and money. The more coverage we get of a situation, the more likely we are to get contributions from individuals for sure. And I think we'd have to admit it probably increases contributions from foundations and corporations as well. What's been the media coverage like throughout the state of Texas, and has that made a difference in encouraging contributions?
Well, I think the media coverage has been good initially, but as Damian mentioned, and Jim too, when you get donor fatigue, I think it's on the news. The first part of the disaster, you see it every day. And then after a week or so, it's gone away, and it's what is the next disaster. So I think it's important to keep this situation, to make the public aware of the situation and let them know how they can donate or how they can contribute to help the state of Texas recover from this epic flooding.
Stephanie, how about in the greater Houston area?
Yeah, I agree exactly with what she's saying, and especially with donor fatigue. And one of the things is the mayor's office has been really good about press releases and keeping people up to date on what's going on in each new flood event and what the plans are. And I think that, in comparison to the Memorial Day floods last year, has really improved the donations coming in. And then they also, of course, the Houston the mayor's office organized a big concert at Lakewood Church, which was with Joel Osteen a major church here, and with Clay Walker and lots of big personalities that all donated their time and efforts in kind, and we saw a big turnout for that, and that got a lot of publicity because it was free to the public, and you could donate if you wanted to, but I think that gave a lot of goodwill of, you know, offering something to the public and showing that we're all trying to come together, and here are these celebrities coming to help and draw attention to the cause.
Bob, this is Damian. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the points that were mentioned earlier. Here in Texas, when we're talking to potential donors after disasters, we like to say that ideally 70% of the funds or 60% of the funds that are donated be held in reserve to support long-term recovery efforts. Here in Texas, at least, response, there's a lot of money in response. There's far less funding available for long-term recovery efforts, particularly in those smaller, more rural communities that were discussed earlier by all of the panelists. And those are the communities where the funds are truly needed, and they're really struggling throughout the state to raise those funds. For example, we had flooding here in Central Texas, which is where Austin is, which is a major city. That was 4 disasters, or 5 rather, disasters ago. That disaster is no longer in the minds of folks, and they're really struggling to raise funds, and they're now competing with 5 subsequent disasters to raise funding. So just a kind of word of caution is, when you're raising funds, try to keep some of that in reserve for long-term recovery. In addition, when you're making a donation, try to donate local so that the funding stays within the communities. Something else that we're seeing here in Texas is that a lot of the donations don't necessarily stay within the communities that they're intended for. They may go to other parts of the state or other parts of the country. So we really want to ensure that those funds are staying within the communities that they're intended to help.
And one other thing I'd like to mention for the funders on the call, most of our voluntary organizations work really hard to vet the clients that we're serving, and we make sure, when Jim showed that the chart of how we help the voluntary organizations, make sure that there's no duplication of benefits from what FEMA or the state has given to the clients.
So we have some questions from the audience. So let's start with this one on case management. And Damon, maybe you can get us started, and then Jim, you might, and Elizabeth might want to join in here. But can you talk a little bit about the case management agencies, both how important it is to fund them, but you know, what are they doing now that they've got multiple events on top of each other? Damian, let's start with you.
Sure, I can start with that. So during the long-term recovery phase, a lot of the case management efforts tend to be volunteer-driven. As most of us on this call know, it's really difficult to find volunteers that are committed to work with a disaster survivor for months, if not years. So one of the best benefits of providing funding to case managers through long-term recovery is that you're ensuring that you're hiring high-quality case managers who are willing to do the work and can walk the disaster survivor through the entire process. I know, Jim, you can probably speak a little bit to the disaster case management program, and Liz, you can probably speak more to case management as well.
Jim, how about you?
Yeah,
talk a little bit about case management.
Was that for Jim or Liz?
This is Jim.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yes. I helped to develop a disaster case management program that FEMA implements now post Katrina, and one of the programs that individual assistance at FEMA funds on request and when it's needed is disaster case management funding to the state, and then the state contracts or subgrants out to primarily nonprofits to build capacity in terms of hiring, training, and supporting case managers. That's as with other FEMA individual assistance programs, that's time limited and can be for up to 24 months. But one of the things I've experienced personally and professionally, is that even when that program is ramped up and runs for 2 years, it's often the case that extended case management is still needed. And imagine the situation where you have, as Damian was mentioning, it's difficult to find volunteers, but then you hire up staff, you get them well trained, they know their communities well and are very effective, and then you need to downsize or lay them off. So I think really a great area of need nationally, but certainly here in Texas with these events, is funding to extend the time those case managers can continue to work.
Elizabeth, this is a question for you from another listener, and they ask this: have you discovered any successful strategies to help decouple press coverage from donations, volunteering, and VOAD response to help even out funding for low attention disasters? And I guess I would add to that for multiple disasters where there's a need for case management over a long time.
Well, we have found both in Texas and across the country that for the low attention disasters, and especially in our rural areas, for example, in Texas, that if we can tell a family story, if we can get on television, if we can work with the local media to give an example of a family that we've been able to help through disaster case management, then that's effective in getting additional donations. So we have to tell the story of the survivors, and we also need to let the donors know how we're going to use the funding, that we have outcomes, that we do measurements, that we do audits, so that they have assurances that their dollars will go a long way and that they will have a return on their investment. I would like to mention that today I'm over in Louisiana, and I'm actually doing a disaster case management training for the state of Louisiana for a disaster case management program. They're getting ready to start for the flooding. And one of the things that I've said to the attendees here is disaster case management is probably the most critical aspect of long-term recovery, because families, they're in trauma, and for example, in Texas, they've been through multiple floods and multiple incidents, and they really need someone to sit down with them and help them do a partnership plan to look to the future and to discuss options. And those options may mean they may have to move to another community. They may not be able to rebuild where they are. They may have some additional health issues that have occurred because of multiple disasters. And children especially are extremely vulnerable in disasters, and we look for what type of resources can we provide through disaster case management to help those children become whole again.
Stephanie, do you have some tips as well to add about what we can do to increase donations, or what some, maybe you can share some of the strategies you've tried that have been successful in the greater Houston area?
Yeah, I think kind of what I was saying, or what I said initially, is our biggest lesson was really timeliness. And, you know, if you wait too long after the event, it's unlike our recent events where it was just kind of these rolling storms that keep coming, is that immediate word getting out there to the public, and really the quick implementation and the quick services to the public have really, I think, sent the message that the city cares, the funders care, and that gets people to want to get on board. And so I think that's definitely the timeliness, and then what someone else was saying about just kind of the media of getting the word out there has definitely increased donations this time versus the flooding event we had last year. Stark difference in the amounts raised.
Okay, thank you. I want to try to understand the role that local organizations play in and how that differs from what FEMA plays, because I think there's often confusion among donors. Jim, you made it very clear during your presentation that you're not the first one in, and you're certainly not the last one to leave. But I think there are many funders who still think FEMA will take care of all of this. And you've made it clear, and Damian's made it clear that's not the case. So let's try to just clarify that a little bit. And Jim, maybe you could remind us first what you do, what FEMA does, and what it doesn't do, and then we can better understand from Damian what the local organizations will be left to do. So, Jim, why don't you get us started on this issue?
Sure. Yeah. Essentially, as I was mentioning about whether or not a county gets declared, they push up through the state to the federal government. FEMA offers supplementary resources, really. If you think about housing in particular, which is often the most difficult resource for people to gain after a disaster, the highest impact, our grants are limited. Every year it goes up a little bit, but a maximum grant of $33,000, for example, does not necessarily restore people to the same condition they were previously, particularly if they don't have insurance or they're underinsured and that sort of thing. So FEMA can, in terms of housing, that's an important resource. In terms of disaster case management, for example, once again, as I mentioned before, that's a temporary program. 2 years may sound like a long time, but I know from personal experience we always come to the end of that program when it's granted, and there are households that still need that resource, that personal attention and time to complete their recovery as far as they can go. Same thing with our crisis counseling program. That also is resourced through the state and usually to nonprofit organizations. But then once again, it's heartbreaking, and I've worked in that program 3 years after Katrina. We still had folks that needed that resource. And then it's heartbreaking to have to lay off your staff and then, et cetera, to the nonprofit communities. So really the local organizations, and I'll segue here to Damian for comments, but my experience as a voluntary agency liaison is, once again, the locals are first in, and they're going to stay there throughout. So, I mean, they really are the backbone of recovery, always have been, way before there were federal programs.
Damian, give us your perspective on this, and talk a little bit about your relationship to what FEMA does and doesn't do.
Sure. So just to kind of piggyback on some of Jim's comments, a max grant from FEMA is about approximately $33,000. Many of the homes that are destroyed or are badly damaged require repairs in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Those homes and the responsibility for paying for those repairs and rebuilds falls predominantly on the long-term recovery groups that have been spoken about. And long-term recovery is the transition from the presence of national organizations to the local community. So with that, it's a portion of recovery when a lot of the larger organizations that those of us on the call are familiar with start to demobilize a lot of the staff and a lot of the manpower that weren't there pre-disaster. And it's really up to those local community foundations, those local community-based organizations to try to find the funding, the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in many cases in Texas over the past year, the millions of dollars that are needed to repair and rebuild the homes. Once the media coverage has left, traditionally speaking, a lot of folks, particularly with flooding, think that the community is back to normal. That's not even remotely the case. Houston and some of the other larger cities are fortunate in that they have a large pool of donors to draw from. Most of the communities, particularly the more rural communities in the state, don't have that luxury. And we have 254 counties in Texas. It's an enormous state. So it's really difficult for a lot of these more rural, smaller communities to garner that attention at the local level and at the state level. So it's really up to the hyper-local communities, those grassroots, community-based, faith-based organizations to try to identify the opportunities for funding, which I'm honestly putting out a plea to the different funders on this call to please consider funding long-term recovery efforts throughout our state, particularly some of those 25 long-term recovery groups that I talked about earlier, and most importantly in the more rural communities, because frankly, I don't think that some of these communities are going to have the opportunity to recover from some of these floodings without additional outside support.
Okay, that's Damian Morales from the OneStar Foundation. Elizabeth, you talked a little bit earlier about housing boxes, and we had a listener write in with a question. If you could just describe again what a housing box is, and how are you manufacturing those or preparing those?
Okay, it's not a housing box. It's called House in a Box, and we provide new furniture for families. For a family of 4, we buy it en masse, so we buy 20 setups at a time from national vendors. It costs us $1,850 to be able to furnish a home for a family of 4. Everyone receives a bed, everyone receives a dresser, everyone receives a dinette. They get pots and pans and dishes and silverware and bathroom items. We call it House in a Box because many of the items are like IKEA items. They come in a box and the family has to assemble them. This has been one of our most successful programs. We have 7 of them currently that are active across the United States, and it's a great way for families to begin again. It gives them hope, and we're giving everyone the same type of items in a community. So for example, in the Houston community during the Memorial Day floods, we were helping families, and all the couches were the same beige color. So all the dinettes were the same. The towels were the same. So we try to do kind of a uniform and standardize, and that way our national vendors that we work with, it's easier for them to give us the volume discounts when we're able to do an industrial scale model. We go through our disaster case managers, and as Damian mentioned, on the long-term recovery committees, all the organizations have the ability to refer families to us as long as they've been vetted and that we're not duplicating anything that FEMA has given to the families. But again, it's a good way that we can provide an immediate start for families who have either gone to a temporary housing situation into an apartment or a trailer, or have rebuilt their home and are moving in again, and that's one less cost that they have.
We've got less than 10 minutes to go, and I've got 2 questions I want to ask all 4 of you to answer. And so you'll need to answer in 30 seconds or so. But the first question is, for those who may be listening and haven't had an experience like this yet, or may be working with their communities to plan better or do some prevention work, what's the #1 lesson learned you've had from this experience in Texas? And Stephanie, let's start with you, and then go to Jim, and then Damian, and then Elizabeth. But Stephanie, what's the lesson learned that you can pass on to others?
Yeah, #1 lesson learned is, again, just timeliness of getting the word out and mobilizing resources to really get the community involved and have them buy into what you're putting out there.
Or Jim, I'm sorry, Jim?
Yes, there's so many lessons, but I would say get involved locally in advance, make a plan, develop those resources in terms of long-term recovery. Identify, I guess really the bottom line is to identify who those natural community leaders are, partner with them, and be ready to move forward.
Damian?
Greatest lesson learned for this disaster, I'd say there are 2, one of which is have conversations with potential funders pre-disaster, help them better understand how they can engage during both response and recovery, and really focus and emphasize on the need to fund recovery efforts. And #2, don't just assume because there's press coverage that you're going to get volunteers. Really identify your pools of volunteers pre-disaster as well.
And Elizabeth?
Yes, I would say to encourage our nonprofits to become members of the voluntary organization active in disaster in their community, so that we have an integrated plan for both response and recovery, and also to work with those community partners to get memorandum of understandings in place ahead of the disaster. So when a disaster hits, we can all work together on trying to secure funding and work on our recovery programs.
All right, thank you all for those very good answers. I want to ask one last question for all four of you, and I wanted, you've already addressed this in some ways, but I want this to be the last words that our listeners hear today as they go back to their homes and to think about what they may be able to do. What are some of the needs that remain unfunded, and how can philanthropy best meet those needs? And let's go through the same order again, starting with Stephanie with the Greater Houston Community Foundation.
The biggest need that we have seen is infrastructure and case management, and donors. You know, there's plenty of organizations out there and agencies that provide that support. So that is what we have seen from our end is, like others have mentioned, the long-term case management after all the initial help is finished, and just overall infrastructure for these areas.
Jim?
Yes, I would say to find an effective, secure way to get resources to the local long-term recovery groups. And I would say primarily through state, national, and in Houston's case, you know, the city organizations that vet those resources and can be channeled into where they're needed at the local level.
Damian?
Money, manpower, and materials, the latter two of which can be accomplished through money. So we really need funding to fund the manpower, to fund the disaster case managers, who can then work with the survivors to access resources and access materials to repair and rebuild their homes and reclaim their lives.
And Elizabeth?
I would echo that funding for disaster case management is critical because we can help families navigate, and that would be number one. Number two would be additional funding for unmet needs like the furniture need. And number three, especially in our rural communities, we need housing options. We need funding to provide alternative housing for families who have lost everything.
All right, we've run out of time, and I want to thank you so much to our panelists. We've heard today from Stephanie Blair, who's with the Greater Houston Community Foundation, from Jim Davis, who's with Region 4 of FEMA, Damian Morales, who's with the OneStar Foundation, and Elizabeth Disco-Shearer from the St. Vincent de Paul services. So thank you so much to taking the time to share your insights with us. Thanks to all of you who joined in this webinar today. I hope it will motivate you and inspire you to either call these four panelists or to call us here at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy to see what you can do to get involved. We also want to extend our thanks to the Council on Foundations for their participation of this webinar. And if you have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's call, you can email them to us here at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.